So I'm going to start by talking about a ABC post that came out uh, last week in relation to registration of social workers in general, and this is something I've been advocating for many years, primarily because of my experience working with social workers, and the issue for me has always been that social workers that I've worked with, and I can say this now that I'm no longer that I've retired, and so I feel I've got a little bit more space to talk about issues in relation to social work and the child protection system with a bit more freedom, I guess, than what I've had in the past. Now, there's a range of social workers who work within the child protection system because there are a range of different types of workers. Now, not every worker in the child protection system is a social worker, and I'll talk a little bit about the importance of that in just a moment. But I certainly meet up with a variety of people who do some fabulous work within the child protection system. And then I meet up a lot of other people, probably more of this category, who are crappy at what they do. And it was a continual disappointment for me as a social worker to be aware of the number of people that were purporting to do social work. Some were social workers, some weren't. It was really difficult when I was working with parents to find out actually whether someone was a social worker or not. And my understanding now, after reading this article, which I'll show you in just a moment, was that there are a number of people clearly who weren't social workers, but doing social work type work. And one of the problems that I had on a continuing basis was that the principles and values that I believed were important as a social worker were not expressed by many of the people that I was working with. And this didn't necessarily mean that the people that I was working with were young, even though the majority of them were, and there's certainly a lot of social workers who in fact were, how can I put it, inexperienced, I guess, because they were young. And sometimes they were experienced because they entered social work when they were older, which is fair enough. But at the end of the day, many of the people that I worked with were crap. And in fact, I know that there were many social workers who also, like myself, were dissatisfied with the level of social work that was practiced within the child protection system. Now, my argument for many years has been that because these people were ineffectual in what they did, many of the decisions that they had to make harmed children, damaged children, in fact, in reality, destroyed their lives. And I became extremely concerned by the degree to which social work was being devalued because it wasn't practiced, and social work was presented as the model that these people were supposed to be using, and in reality were not. So it became I became more and more frustrated with this system. The result of that frustration, I started in 2015 the Child Protection Party, which I hope that many of you watching are a party to or would at least join. I no longer am involved with that. But I'm going to talk about the article that was on the ABC last week, which I find a little disturbing. And the article is this one, which is fears child protection and domestic violence workers could quit under SA South Australian Registration Scheme. Now, the point I need to make here is, for those of you that do not know, is that here in South Australia, the Australian Association of Social Workers has worked towards registering social workers. Because like psychologists, like the medical profession, like podiatrists, like a whole host of professionals, social work wasn't registered or recognised as a profession in the same way that some of these other health professionals were. And it became important to me and to many others to at least have social workers have that recognition. I mean, many of us, in my case in particular, I did a 4-year degree. It was heavy duty shit, but I went and did it. And it was one of the best experiences I've ever had, actually. But so it became more and more important, I guess, for social workers simply to have their qualifications recognised, and along with their qualifications becomes the ethics and the principles that are important to them. So, and this has been embedded now in legislation, which I think passed in 2021 or 2022. Anyway, in this particular article, it says the fears that child protection domestic violence workers could quit under SA registration scheme. So on July the 1st, from July the 1st, social workers in South Australia need to become registered to work. Some groups are concerned experienced workers without direct social work qualifications might leave if forced to spend time and money upskilling. A spokesman from the board says it will still working through details of who would be required to attain registration. So that's in essence what it's supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about registration of social workers, blah, 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 blah. But then there are some people who find objections to that. And these objections are not new. Some years ago, in fact, they decided that the Department of Child Protection, it was Family Services back then, they chose to upgrade people from who were not social workers, who were just working with kids and families, and they decided to upgrade them, and they grandparented them into social work. So they gave them a title. I don't know whether it necessarily meant they had a degree or whatever, but they gave them a title. So now, though, we're going to make it official so that if a person, a parent or a child for that matter, has a complaint against the way that they've seen a social worker working, they will then be able to register that complaint with a particular body, the social work registration body, who will then be able to follow through on that complaint, find out whether it's justified or not, and then exert some sort of punishment, I guess, or some sort of correction to the social worker so that their practice will improve. And particularly where social workers behave very badly, proving over and over again that they aren't in accordance with the ethics and principles of social work, then those people would then hopefully be deregistered and therefore couldn't practice as a social worker. So it's the title social worker that is really important, and this is what this whole legislation is focusing on. But there are a lot of people who work as or call themselves social workers who are not social workers. And those people, I think, are the people that are being called out now because it's discovered that there's so many of them who have that title but don't have a degree or an equivalent qualification that identifies them as being appropriate professionals in the social work career. So domestic violence and child protection workers could leave if South Australia pushes ahead and with proposed guidelines for a national first social work registration scheme. Advocates are warning. Remember, it is a national first, so and that's important to note. The scheme, touted by the SA government as the first of its kind in Australia, requires social workers to become registered to work in the state from July the 1st this year, so it's rapidly approaching. While the government and sector agree the scheme would improve accountability and professional standards, some organisations are concerned about how it is currently proposed to operate. So it's interesting to note there that that's the government and sector, so the government and child and social workers in particular, agree the scheme would improve accountability and professional standards. Some organisations are concerned about how it is currently proposed to operate. And actually what they're saying here is that they're concerned that if they don't have a good degree as a social worker, they need to go off and get one, stiff bickies, or that they need to now meet a certain standard, which they clearly haven't been able to meet in the past, and are now feeling pretty uneasy about that. And there's a lot of people who practice as social workers who have got no idea what social work principles and values are. And I need to add, there are a lot of social workers who don't either, which is another issue for complaint and one of concern. But at least a social work standard will enable people like yourselves to be able to make complaints against social workers where you're feeling aggrieved. So this is a complex and difficult work in a very vulnerable space that holds a lot of risk. There's no doubting about any of that. The ultimate risk is that children could die. This is Melissa Gibson. Laws to establish the registration scheme passed Parliament 21. A board set up by the government and so forth. However, the board has consulted social work industry groups on its proposed scope of practice. Groups contacted by ABC News said the board's proposed definition of social work services was too broad and could result in a range of experienced workers who do not have direct social work qualifications having to spend time and money upskilling to be eligible for registration. And my issue around that is the excuse, and we need to be really mindful of this, is that, if you've got a family that is experiencing social workers or experiencing workers within a child protection system and particularly Department of Child Protection here in South Australia, you will have the right to say to that person, are you a social worker? Because at least now you will know that that social worker will have a certain standard, a certain set of principles, if you like, that they should be abiding by. And if you feel aggrieved by that, you can then consequently make a complaint. What they're saying here is that the definition of social work for some people is too broad. In other words, these policies, these procedures, the way that social workers are taught to behave and think about people's issues and are not, particularly judgment. So one of the issues for me over the years has been that people tend to mother blame. So they just see the mother as the problem. And I can't count the number of times there's been domestic violence and they listen to the male's issues and they don't take on the woman's issues. And as a result of all of that, they remove the child and sometimes place these kids with the father, and because it's always the mother's fault, no matter what happens. That's not social work practice. It's not a good social work principle. It's unethical. So what is important, though, now is to understand that there should be this standard that people have in relation to all of this. And some people are now complaining that they do not, or believe that they will not meet this standard. And this is the problem. They will not meet the standard. It's argued that many people who are not social workers might subject to regulation via the Social Work Registration Board. And that's true. And I can't see, because some people may find a way by which they get registered as a social worker, but may not specifically have a social work qualification. Now, the fact that they're concerned about what that standard might be by the board is in itself a concern, because that means that they're not prepared to work by a specifically higher standard than the one that they think is appropriate. And I'd like to get those people in a room and say, hey, hold on, what do you think is an appropriate social work standard? And give them some case studies and find out how social workers would work around that as opposed to how they would work around it. Because I can assure you, they would have a range of biases that would impact the way that they actually work, which would in effect contradict the way social workers, in terms of their social work training at least, should work. It goes on to say here, our worry is that employers may well need to rearrange their workforce or think about who they're going to employ in order to manage the complications of the registration process, and that ultimately will impact on the most vulnerable people in South Australia. And I've never seen such a load of crap in my entire life. So I'll just carry on with this and then I'll just finish off, because otherwise I'll just bore you silly. Mrs. Toohey said that many people working in the social services sector do not have direct social work degrees, but had related qualifications in areas such as public health or psychology. And if they have another degree that's similar, like, I don't know what they mean by public health, but certainly psychologists who don't have, so they're referring there to psychologists who don't have a clinical psychology qualification, so they haven't gone on and done their masters and other stuff, but do have simply a psychology degree. Those people should qualify. But the standards that they should qualify under should be the social work standards. And that's the issue for me. She goes on to say, she said, while the board had proposed that some social workers could use their existing experience to qualify for registration, others might end up having to do further study. Who cares? If you're not going to meet the social work standard, and I hope that the registration board is really clear about what that standard is, because there are many parents out there who know that a standard is not met in terms of simply respecting who they are as individuals. And many of those people, those parents out there in particular, feel judged, feel denigrated by, talked down to. I've worked with some people parents who have been yelled at, shouted at, screamed at, put down, and have nowhere to go in order to have their grievances heard. They now have a space, a place in which they can go to. And it's important to understand that to have that space is an integral part of being able to work with a service such as a social work service, whereby your needs are going to be met. The outcomes for your kids are going to be better. You're going to feel more comfortable with the process if you're being treated with respect. And I'm hoping that the idea of registration will mean that the standards that are now required will mean that everyone who encounters a social worker or someone who's titled as a social worker, who is registered, will be somebody who will respect you. I'm hoping that at the end of the day, that is what will happen. And I want to say to you, if you're watching this on YouTube, as some people will be later on, please subscribe to my channel, ring the bell for further notifications, and so on. So, in the meantime, thanks for watching. I really appreciated the opportunity to present to you on YouTube. And if you'd like to hear more or see some more videos from me around some of these issues, please let me know in the comment section below. In the meantime, take care, look after yourselves, and more importantly, be safe.